Well, I think I may want to give this to Dave to start. I'll leave that to his discretion, but I do have an update for you on the litigation, and we're actually filing something moments from now, which is kind of exciting, but that may be Dave's prerogative to announce.
Let's go to Dave. I've got all kinds of opportunities here.
There he
Hello,
is.
Dave.
How you doing?
Fire away.
Well, it's interesting listening to what was preceding here in reference to Building 7 and also our litigation in the Southern District with the architects and engineers, the lawyers committee, and trying to get a grand jury. Now, what we're doing, as you know, we want to study all the various crimes of 9/11 and do grand jury petitions. And the various crime we were studying recently for the last 6 months was the anthrax attacks of 2001, and where 5 people were killed and 17 were poisoned or injured. And 2 of the people that were received letters were U.S. senators, and that was Senator Leahy and Senator Daxel. And shortly thereafter, you had the Patriot Act coming into reality, where a lot of our freedoms have been reduced since that time. And you also had wars with Iraq and Afghanistan, and which the results are still with us. So, but for that act of 9/11, had it been investigated properly, none of us probably would be here. We'd be doing something differently, which is ironic. But what we've been doing is studying the anthrax, and we've come up with some very interesting insights so that we can make certain statements now based on the evidence we have thus far accumulated. One of the differences I notice that jumps out while we're trying to get grand jury going down in the Southern District, there actually was a grand jury on anthrax, and it lasted until the alleged suspect committed suicide, and that was Bruce Ivins. And Bruce Ivins was a over 30-year veteran of USAMRIID, which is the United States Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases, and Fort Detrick. You probably heard of Fort Detrick. And we have made connections with the scientists at Fort Detrick. And in our declaration, you will see a number of scientists, at least four scientists, 3 of them colonels. And they know Bruce very well. In fact, when he died at his funeral, there were hundreds of people there, and they were all crying because they appreciated him. And the bottom line is they think that he got the raw deal. He was a scapegoat. Now, going back to what we're doing now, we have this, we were preparing for a grand jury petition to announce that a second filing to a U.S. attorney down in Washington. So the Lawyers Committee would be having involvement with a petition in New York City and a lawsuit in New York City, and we'd be doing a grand jury petition in Washington. What transpired, however, is that we received additional evidence, and we also discovered additional evidence that we want to review. So the grand jury petition is very large right now, but we're going to make it larger. But of course, we're going to make it good quality. And we had a plan. It was a 5-step plan, and we reversed the steps. So today we're doing step 3, which is now step 1. And what we're doing is we are petitioning Congress. We're getting Congress involved. Back at that time, Rush Holt was a congressman, and Congressman Nadler. They were very much interested in getting a bill passed to do a similar 9/11 investigation, only they would get it reference to the anthrax. And we want something similar to that. We want an independent counsel involved. So when today, in fact, we announced it yesterday. We were on the Jason Goodman show in New York City. I was up there And Mick was zoomed in, and we were with Merle Nass and Graham McQueen. They were both zoomed in. Now, Graham is on our anthrax committee, and Merle is a consultant to the lawyers committee. And of course, you know Mick and you know myself. We have a anthrax committee that Barbara's on it. She's a researcher and very active in it, and does quality work. And we have 2 other researchers, and Graham being one of them. You know, he's written a book on it. And we have 4 attorneys that are right on top of it too. And we've been meeting for 6 months. We've interviewed Richard Lambert for about 3 hours. He came before us. Richard Lambert was the head of the Amerithrex investigation. He's the FBI. He is the top FBI man in charge of that investigation. And he left it after 4 years. He believed he was being undermined, and we could give a litany of reasons why. In fact, he was so upset when he left, he gave them a 2,000-page document that no one's seen since. And we would like Congress, because he's told us Congress can have it released. In that document, there's 16 pages he refers to being exclusively devoted to Bruce Ivins, and Bruce Ivins, and to exculpate Bruce Ivins. So he didn't believe that Bruce Ivins was the anthrax killer, which is pretty significant if you think about it. The head of the FBI in that investigation thinks that the person who eventually is fingered as the killer isn't the killer. And he leaves the investigation because he believes he's being undermined. Now, leading up to Ivins' unfortunate demise, the FBI first, of course, you may have heard about Al-Qaeda. There was talks right away that Al-Qaeda was involved. And then it moved to Iraq. And this was big time coming out of the press. They were just drumming it up. But the curious thing happened. The anthrax was found to contain a clay substance called bentonite. Not bentonite. It didn't. What it contained. Normally it would have contained bentonite if Iraq was involved. But what was in it was a silicone, and it was maybe even more important to identify as an American. It was called Ames strain, and Ames strain is not made with bentonite. So that sort of gave an indication this must be an inside job. And so what happened then is that the FBI went to work on some people in Chester, Pennsylvania. 2 guys were employed there. They lost their job. They weren't the suspects. Then they went after a doctor in New York. He lost his marriage. He wasn't the suspect and lost his job. Then they went after a guy named Perry Mikesell. And Mikesell worked with Battelle and also formerly at Yosemite. They put so much pressure on him. He was drinking and drinking. He had a liver problem, and he died from liver poisoning. Poisoning of the liver from drinking. Then they went after Stephen Hatfill, who was a fairly rugged fellow, and they hound dogged him for a long time. And finally he had enough, and he sued them, and he won about $5 million. And then they went after Bruce Ivins, and they watched him 24/7, and he had some previous mental issues, and they squeezed him, and eventually he dies on July 28th, 2008, and with apparently from Tylenol poisoning. That's what they said. However, at the time he was taking antidepressant, 3 of them, and there's some indication that he was being watched 24/7, and there's some people that have told us that they believe he was murdered. So based on our investigation, Ivins couldn't have done it for the simple reason that besides, from what we could see, he wasn't the type of person that would do that, according to his friends and according to the scientists. At Yosemite and Fort Detrick, they didn't have the facilities. This kind of anthrax they utilize at Fort Detrick is liquid. And what was used in these attacks was a powder. And the second attack that went to Daxel and Leahy was the finest powder anthrax anyone has ever witnessed before. It was simply amazing. In fact, the Army said Given it a context here, in 1969, President Nixon shut the program down. They were afraid that third world countries would get hold of these little Frankensteins and be able to run things. And Nixon said we could take care of it with our nuclear arsenal. So in 1972, a bioweapons treaty was signed, and all the countries were supposed to not create any offensive weapons. You could have a little anthrax defensively for vaccines and things of that nature. What we saw in 2001, or what everybody witnessed then, was a fine powder that was a concentration on one gram of it of 1 trillion spores. Think of that, 1 trillion spores on 1 gram of it. Now, those envelopes could take up to 2 grams. They didn't have 2 grams in it, but they could take up to 2 grams and get it through the mail. So that's something right there. So there was other curious things too with regards to this particular type of anthrax. It was so energized that it actually contaminated 12 of the people at Fort Detrick who were examining it for the first time. They never seen anything like that. So they said it was 10 times more stronger than anything they've seen since 1969. Now, in architects and engineers is very well familiar with the hypothesis that the NIST puts forward, which is to do the least possible thing as far as what caused the collapse of Building 7 or the Twin Towers. And a reasonable person would have, of course, at first checked the dust and et cetera. They would have had explosive tests. And that would be the, I think, logical. If you just saw it and you didn't have the spin from it or the context, you'd say, boy, that's come down from controlled demolition. That's what it looks like, right? And not from office fires caused by fuel jet. So what happened with regards to Ivins and Fort Detrick, they were the least likely place to have powdered anthrax, but the most likely places were Battelle and Dugway. And Mick will tell you why Battelle and Dugway come in, and Battelle is a big CIA contractor. And but what we yesterday announced and what we're announcing right now is 3 different things. Is that Bruce Ivins was innocent, and unfortunately he was sacrificed, and for the crime here, his family was destroyed, and of course he was killed. And there was a grand jury at that time, but as soon as he died, the FBI conveniently had it closed down. So that's the difference. We don't have to prove that there was bombs in the building because the anthrax, because the government admits there's anthrax. In fact, the government admits it looks like it was American anthrax. Now we have to decide who is responsible for it. So our first proposition is that Ivins wasn't responsible for it. He was an innocent person. The second is that the FBI was obstructive, deceptive, and very malicious in the way they treated him. And the ultimate verdict on their behavior will hopefully be decided in the grand jury, because they may be themselves suspects in covering this up. And we've seen that before, government agencies, and you are familiar with the NIST and what the Shem Sundar and John Gross say. Well, there's FBI guys that are doing something similar here, it seems. We haven't gotten far enough into it to make that conclusion. But we want to get more evidence, and we want to reopen the grand jury. And or the third, because the system is so corrupt, and maybe we'll get some bright light in what architects and engineers is doing, and with the verdict down in New York City. But we want to get Congress involved. Now, we've talked to, in fact, Rush Holt. He's actually called us, and we've talked to him. And Rush Holt was the person that who sponsored the first bill. Now, he's not in there right now, but he says that he appreciates us. He says, you guys are dogged, and keep me advised, and we will. We will. We've called the different senators' offices, Leahy's office, and said a word, and Nadler to congressmen, etc. So we're going to be notifying and today, later, and Mick will update you on that. The key congressional people, eventually we'll get approximately 48-page petition, and with the exhibits. Now, the exhibits, I said, a lot of them are new. Colonel Anderson, Arthur Anderson, very brave person. He was a head of ethics review at Fort Detrick. He has assisted us, and he was very upset about what they did with Ivins. And you can read the declarations, as I said, on LC4 at 911.org. If you think that the work we're doing is valuable work, we'd like to continue it, and we'd like to do it in the other jurisdictions too, eventually with Shanksville. But the next one will probably be government obstruction and misconduct. There may be others out there who would like to get involved in that. That is going to be really a big, big, big effort. But we know that's everywhere, in every agency. And then there's Shanksville, of course. And then there's a very controversial situation with the Pentagon, where there's the different hypotheses, all intriguing hypotheses, which the Lawyers Committee has not examined and studied or taken a position on. But we take a position on this. We have an open mind. We will look at all evidence presented to us, and we'll do the best job we can to get it right. And we know it's hard after 20 years to do that. Not easy. But so, and on Sunday, we're going to have our event. It won't probably be as good as your event in a sense, but we're going to have some top speakers there. Bill Binney will be at our event. Bill Binney from the NSA, whistleblower, Ray McGovern, whistleblower, CIA, Francis Boyle, who is the architect or the drafter of the bioweapons treaty. Amazing. He's an attorney. He's going to be there along with Merle and Graham and Mick and Barbara and myself. Bill Jacoby there. Christopher Joy will be there. And I hope I'm not leaving anybody out. You're going to have to fill it in, Barbara and Mick, if I left somebody out. So we're going to have 10 speakers in only 3 hours. It's going to be hard. So everybody's going to have to take a little bit less. But that's a little bit what I wanted to say. This anthrax is kind of fascinating. It goes from one level to another. When Mick will mention about these morphs, which were a big key identifier, and then the B. bacillus subtilis, and then to the tin and the silicone, and that which is really used in the refined stuff that I just mentioned. So again, I salute everybody out there, because we're keeping the flame going. Everyone in architects and engineers, they're inspiration for the Lawyers Committee. Hopefully we'll be inspiration for others, and let's just keep it going. I thank you very much. Thanks, Richard.
So Dave, I think it's Barb's.
Okay, Barb's next. Okay, good enough. Barbara, you got it? Go ahead.
Yeah, I suppose I'm going to go straight. Richard, great, there's my first slide. Hey, the slides are working. Mick was going to go first, but I got a message that because the slides were not in the order that they were originally intended, that I need to go next. So anyway, hi everybody. First, I want to thank Richard Gage and Architects and Engineers for this absolutely magnificent event. That's number one. Number two, I just would like to say that it's an honor to be part of the Lawyers Committee. I'm on the board, I'm an officer, and I'm on the Anthrax Petition Committee. And it's been an amazing ride to get to this day when we're about to file our petition to Congress. And next month, hopefully in mid-October, around the 15th, we'll be filing our grand jury petition in Washington, D.C. as well for a grand jury. So I just wanted to thank everybody for that. May I have my next slide, please, Richard? See if it comes up. Hey, great. Okay, it's hard for me to read that slide because the text is so small. However, I believe it says this. Very good, thank you. This is the famous quote by Margaret Mead, the famous anthropologist, to never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. I happen to believe that. And I just want everybody who's watching this in the 9/11 Truth Movement and the world to know that the Lawyers Committee is absolutely one of those groups of thoughtful, committed citizens who are changing the world. So allow me to bring up my next slide, but not yet, Richard. I just want everybody to know that the Lawyers Committee not only will be making a huge difference, but already has. I'm just going to give one quick example. We have already made the difference, in fact, in what is arguably the most important breakthrough for the 9/11 truth movement to date, the one that has allowed the huge lawsuit by thousands of 9/11 victims' family members to finally move forward in the court. And that is the release of the 28 pages and the passage of the Justice Against Sponsors of Terrorism Act. Mick and myself and Senator Mike Gravel were absolutely central to that happening. So we have already made a huge difference for the movement in the world. And the passage of JASTA, the Justice Against Sponsors of Terrorism Act, has been called a revolution in the very foundation of international law, which indeed it is. So give me just a moment here. Have to know what the next one is. All right. If you would please, the next slide, Richard. All right. So 9/11 truth matters because truth matters. Truth matters hugely. It is impossible to have justice, which is what the Lawyers Committee is about, without truth, and it is impossible to have peace without justice. The truth is that the challenge we face is because the real perpetrators of 9/11, the anthrax attacks and other false flags, do not want peace. They do not want what we want. For them, peace is the enemy, which is why they go to such extreme lengths as they have to lie and bury the truth about 9/11 and, as you will see, the anthrax attacks. If I may have the next slide, please. So, there is one man, probably more than any other in modern history, who knew this, and it was the center of his life, and he acted on it, and that is, of course, Mahatma Gandhi. But he also knew that the truth is not enough. He knew that the truth has to be united with force, with power, with efficacy, so that it makes not just a difference, but the difference. And that difference has to be in the real world, the one that we all experience, not just in the imaginary world or the digital world. And that is the geopolitical world, whether we like it or not. And most people don't know this, but Mahatma Gandhi began his movement to unite truth or facts with power or force on September 11th, right after the turn of the 19th century, just going into the 20th century. And since 9/11, we now face a great and repressive empire in our own country, like the one that he used, Satyagraha, which was their name in Hindi for uniting truth or facts with power. We are now facing just as great a repressive empire as Gandhi faced back then. But in our case, it's the empire of our own country. And we can throw it off and get back to normal, back to being America, by using and having faith in Gandhi's strategy and methods. If I may have the next slide, please. All right. Now, Gandhi's revolution was both a truth revolution and a political revolution. And just to prove to you that we are in the middle of a political revolution in the 9/11 truth movement is this incredible quote from Patrick Henry, who may have made more difference than any other in the American Revolution and its success. For my part, whatever anguish of spirit it might cost, I am willing to know the whole truth, to know the worst, and to provide for it and to act upon it. So if I may have the next slide, please. All right. Now, we all know in the 9/11 truth movement these horrendous consequences of the 9/11 lies. The horrendous consequences. These are well known to the 9/11 truth movement. There are other facts and other truths that are not so well known to the 9/11 truth movement, and we're going to go into those. What is needed, in my opinion, and that's why my opening slide was what I imagine the Holy Grail would look like when we finally get to it and touch it and hold it up in victory. What we need is a Holy Grail for the 9/11 truth movement. For almost 2 decades, our truth movement has been and is actually a search for that Holy Grail. What do I mean by that? A Holy Grail, by that I mean we need a breakthrough to coverage of the facts and what they mean by the mainstream media, by major political parties, by academia, by the whole world. This is the hardest nut to crack. And I've made it my mission to identify what I consider the highest holy grails of 9/11, of 9/11 facts. These are burning facts which, by my definition, alone, standing alone, can prove that the official conspiracy theory of 9/11 is both an immense lie and a psychological operation. There are five, in my opinion, five key holy grails of 9/11 facts. The first is the war games and emergency response or counterterrorism exercises on scenarios of hijacks, even hijacked planes approaching and crashing into buildings on the morning of 9/11 itself. That is, to me, the main holy grail of 9/11 truth in that area. If I could have the next slide, please. So this is the cover of Crossing the Rubicon. And this is a very important book by Michael Ruppert, one of the very first, about the same time, maybe even a little before, as David Ray Griffin's first book. The 9/11, The New Pearl Harbor by David Ray Griffin. And this book has two very, very important chapters. They're arguably the most important chapters. They are on the emergency response counterterrorism exercises, also sometimes called war games, that were happening on 9/11, that mirrored or paralleled the scenarios of the actual attacks of 9/11. And many people don't know that I am the source of the vast majority of the information in those two chapters, 19 and 20. And in the acknowledgments to this book, Michael Ruppert does credit me for, quote, giving him, in his words, the holy grail of 9/11 truth, which are those very facts. If I could have the next slide, please. All right, and now, thank goodness, thanks to my work and Michael Ruppert's work and many others developing this, including many others in the movement, now the emergency response exercises and war games that were happening on 9/11 and being practiced, over 25 of them before 9/11 in the lead up to 9/11, but many on 9/11 itself, mirroring what happened in the actual attacks on 9/11. That is now common knowledge by the 9/11 truth movement, and this is arguably the most efficient way to get that information across to people in the movement. And this, of course, is the War Games documentary by James Corbett. So I highly recommend, if you haven't already, that you be sure and watch that. I need to say a few things about that. I will just say in passing that the other holy grails, and I'm getting up to the one that matters, the anthrax attacks, the other holy grails, according to me, besides the war games on 9/11, are the massive inside deep basement explosions in both World Trade Center towers that happened before a plane hit either tower. That's an incredible smoking gun. The third one is, of course, the World Trade Center collapse in a classic controlled demolition, 3 buildings, 2 planes, and we have the magnificent work of architects and engineers and others in the movement to thank for that. The fourth one is a pre-plane time approach of a massive inside explosion at the Pentagon at 9:30 on the morning of 9/11. And the heroine of that, like Willie Rodriguez, is the hero of what we now know about the pre-plane impacts in the basements of the World Trade Center towers. April Gallup is our heroine for our knowledge of the pre-plane approach, massive inside explosions at the Pentagon on 9/11. Go to my next slide. Now we're getting up to the anthrax attacks, because the anthrax attacks, in my opinion, are actually the highest holy grail of the 5 that I have selected out over 19 years of research on 9/11. There are multiple links of anthrax, reports, counteractions, many other links to anthrax, believe it or not, on the day of 9/11 itself, as well as between the attacks of 9/11 and the very first public awareness of the very first anthrax letter being received, let alone mailed. These were mainstream media and mainstream press articles, high-level government media elites taking anti-anthrax Cipro. The most well-known of these links of anthrax to the day of 9/11 itself is that Jerome Howard, who had been head of security for the World Trade Center and was an expert, in fact, many say obsessed, with the details of building collapses, he personally put the Bush-Cheney White House and its personnel on anti-anthrax Cipro on 9/11. But that is by no means, the only example of anthrax links to the day of 9/11 itself, or at a very minimum, the fear of an anthrax attack on the day of 9/11 itself. All right. So that is extremely, extremely important. So let me scroll down. If I may have the next slide, please. That's already up. Thank you very much. So why the truth about the anthrax attacks matters so much for 9/11 truth and justice. And we'll just leave this slide up if we could. All right, why does it matter? The truth about the anthrax attacks matters so hugely because they have been acknowledged by our government itself to be an inside job. Indeed, that our government insists that we believe that they were an inside job. The FBI and the government's own official conspiracy theory, in fact, is that Bruce Ivins, an Army, a military, even though he was a civilian, an Army microbiologist then at Fort Detrick in Maryland, was the sole anthrax killer, that he did everything, that he created the anthrax, put it in the letters, and mailed the letters. But when you read our lawyers' committee petition, both the one to Congress and in the middle of next month, also to the U.S. Attorney in Washington, D.C., we can prove that Bruce Ivins did not do it and could not have done it. He is literally the patsy, the Lee Harvey Oswald of the anthrax attacks that are directly linked to 9/11 for the reasons I just mentioned, and which were used to pressure Congress, which is a political goal, into passing the Patriot Act. That is the very definition of terrorism. To use violence, in this case, a weapon of mass destruction bioweapon, mailed to civilians, i.e. Senators Leahy and Daschle, for the political goal of pressuring the Congress to quickly pass the Patriot Act. All right. Now, the facts and evidence in our lawyers' committee petition proves, that's the word that attorneys like to use, is dispositive. Not only that Ivins did not do it, but he simply could not have physically done it at all. The real what does this mean? It means that the bottom line is that the real perpetrators of the anthrax attacks, the mass murderer terrorists who used a weapon of mass destruction, a bioweaponized anthrax, against the United States Congress itself, the very heart of our democracy, are still at large. They are armed and dangerous with weapons of mass destruction, and they are free to do it again, and even worse. And remember those words, even worse, for a little bit later. All right. So why could the anthrax attacks be the holy grail of 9/11 truth itself, not just the anthrax truth? If the letters weren't mailed until after September 11th, how could the anthrax attacks, letter attacks, be the holy grail of 9/11 truth itself? Now, at this point, I just need to make a declaration here that up to this point, everything that I've said are simply facts that are well known. They are documented, many of them acknowledged, even insisted that we believe by our own U.S. government and the FBI. From here on out, it's my own research, and I'm not. This is not on behalf of the Lawyers Committee. We've not taken a position on it. Doesn't mean that we won't in the future. All right. So, a few more slides. The answer to that question: how could the anthrax attacks be the holy grail of 9/11 truth itself? Is surprising and something that not many people know, including in the movement. I'm going to do it in what ifs. What if, just like there were war games and counterterrorism exercises on hijack and even plane into tower crash scenarios on the morning of 9/11 itself by our government and military, and we know that there were links of anthrax to the day of 9/11 itself. What if a high-level federal government FEMA New York City counterterrorism exercise just happened to also be planned for the next day, September 12th, for which FEMA and other military and government personnel, including New York City personnel, firefighters, police, etc., were already on alert and in New York City the day before 9/11 on September 12th? What if the scenario for that exercise was on an anthrax attack, a biowarfare attack? maybe, or a bioterrorism attack. Maybe one even using letters mailed to members of the mainstream media in New York City, which actually happened later in October and November. And what if the weeks or months prior to 9/11 that this exercise was being planned and the equipment and personnel for it identified and they were practicing were exactly the same weeks and months that the explosives were being planted in the World Trade Center towers in World Trade Center 7. So it matters immensely. Excuse me. I do have to back up one slide here. All right. And what if the command center for the anthrax attack exercise was on a pier not far from Ground Zero? And what if all the critical functions of the World Trade Center Emergency Operations Center of Mayor Giuliani were able to very quickly and, quote, miraculously, unquote, be set up in what was to have been and became the command center for the bioterrorism exercise on that very pier after World Trade Center just happened to collapse on 9/11 in a classic controlled demolition? Now, these are not if, they are real, they happened. And they are the holy grail, in my opinion, of both the anthrax attacks and 9/11, because any direct links between the anthrax attacks, which the government itself insists was an inside job, and 9/11, which the government is desperate for you not to know was also an inside job. By simple logic 101, 9/11 itself had to also have been an inside job. And by the same or many of the same high-level inside perpetrators who planned the anthrax bioweapons exercise and did the actual real-world anthrax attacks shortly after. No wonder the government, after first wanting you and the public to believe that it was a foreign terrorist organization, Al-Qaeda, that was behind the anthrax attack, but only just long enough to get their Patriot Act rushed through Congress, then and now, they now want you to believe that September 11th attacks and the anthrax attacks are completely unrelated, that a lone nut domestic terrorist named Bruce Ivins did the entire thing himself. Could that possibly be because they don't want the American people in general, and especially you in the 9/11 Truth Movement, to know that the anthrax attacks and 9/11 were both by domestic terrorists, and arguably by the evidence that we now have by the same, or at least some of the same domestic terrorists? That is why it matters immensely that we have proven that Bruce Ivins, the government's chosen patsy domestic terrorist, US terrorist, did not do the anthrax attacks and couldn't have. And why the evidence that we have marshaled as to which or what high-level US military government and government contract labs or other entities almost certainly did is also so hugely important. We now have the holy grail of 9/11. So why does 9/11 matter today? Well, 9/11 matters today for all the reasons we already know. But it also matters hugely today because there is strong evidence. And again, this is myself speaking as a private researcher at this point, but I'm not alone by any means. There are many experts who agree with me, and they have gone public. But it matters so hugely because the evidence strongly supports that both the anthrax, the bioweaponized anthrax in the anthrax letters that I've just shown you are linked in many ways directly to the day of 9/11 itself, and the coronavirus are both genetically engineered weapons, and they have been used for bioterrorism purposes. And one of the very, very best presentations about that was just made yesterday at the 9/11 Film Festival by none other than our own Kevin Ryan. And on the screen, well, it was on the screen, I believe, just before this one. But anyway, be sure and go to noliesradio.org and click on the 9/11 Film Festival, and then go to 5 hours, 24 minutes and 30 seconds in to watch Kevin Ryan's amazing presentation at the 9/11 Film Festival yesterday, which was titled Parallels Between 9/11 and COVID-19, both as violence-based, inside job, psychological operations. And I thank you very much for your attention. I hope you now understand why the anthrax attacks could well be the holy grail of 9/11 truth. Thank you.
So, Dave, I'll pick it up from there if you're okay with that.
Sure. Yes, please.
So, thank you, Barbara and Dave. Since I didn't go first, I will now do what I would have done had I gone first, which is to do a disclaimer, sort of a lawyer's thing. Barbara has already made one, but other than us talking about the anthrax petition and the basic conclusions, we're pretty much speaking for ourselves and not for the lawyers committee. So I just want to make that clear. And we all are at different places in our investigation of the 9/11 related issues, but we have come to a point of common concern about the anthrax attacks. And let me tell you why we're focused on anthrax. Some folks may not have studied the anthrax attacks. They happened in October of 2001, shortly after September 11th. They were the second big scare, the first being the 9/11 attacks themselves. And from our analysis, we have concluded that the primary motive of the anthrax attacks is the same as the primary motive for what was what we call controlled demolition of the Trade Center towers and Building 7. It was essentially a shock and awe campaign against the United States citizens. In other words, there was a goal to motivate us to support attacks on Iraq, attacks in Afghanistan, and the war on terror. And both the destruction of the buildings in New York on 9/11 and the anthrax attacks the next month basically created a climate of fear in this country. And we did rush into a war on terror and attacks on Iraq. And there were early claims that Iraq was responsible for the anthrax attacks. That turned out to be false, just like some other things about Iraq turned out to be false. So 9/11 and the anthrax attacks are very intimately related. And when you read our petition, and I'll give you the status in just a moment of our petition to Congress on the anthrax attacks, when you read it, you'll understand that the science that supported the FBI's conclusions on the anthrax attacks is just as faulty as the science that Ted Walter and Tony Zambodi just explained regarding the Building 7 collapse. It's a similar pattern of what I would call disingenuous scientific argument. So there are a lot of parallels between the anthrax attacks and the 9/11 attacks themselves. So let me remind folks who didn't follow the anthrax attacks closely that they did involve the attempted assassination of two United States senators, Senators Leahy and Senator Daschle. And that was at a time when the Patriot Act, as Barbara said, was being rushed through Congress. These two senators were instrumental in trying to slow down the process and make it more, thoughtful and deliberate. And they became the subjects of this attack, and they could easily have been killed. The anthrax that was sent in the letters in October of 2001, there were two phases. Some were sent in kind of a crude form to the media, New York Post and the American Media Incorporated building in Florida, among others, NBC also, but a more sophisticated form was sent in a couple weeks later, and it was very lethal. As David mentioned, the Army experts that looked at the white powder that came in the second wave of attacks, they were amazed at its sophistication. As David said, it was 1 trillion spores of anthrax per gram, and it was very aerosolized, easily went into the air and distributed through the air, to the point where even the Army's bioweapons experts were surprised. So, this was an attack using biowarfare agent against the United States Congress, and people may have forgotten the significance of that. Now, the problem with the FBI's investigation, as with the World Trade Center 7 report, is it's based on essentially fraudulent science. And we've gone into the details in our petition which I will reveal because I know Dave is on the edge of his seat wanting to know the status. We've been working on this for several months, but we had some new evidence, late-breaking new evidence, which we've been rushing to get in to get the filing done today. And so, Dave, I'll just let you know I finished the last edit moments ago. I've even added your signature and mine. And so this petition to Congress will be filed as soon as we get off of this program. And we'll do it by email, and then we may do it later by mail. So we're ready to go with it. And I appreciate all the help of our committee members. A lot of work has gone into this. Let me give you the gist of why the FBI was wrong in their conclusions that one person, as Dave said, Dr. Bruce Ivins, was the accused, who unfortunately committed suicide and may have been driven to suicide. Why the FBI's conclusion that one person, a lone wolf, did these attacks. The first problem is that the FBI relied on what they call a fingerprint, a genetic fingerprint of the samples taken from the attack letters. And they did some state-of-the-art DNA analysis, which showed some unusual mutant strains, some basically genetic mutations, which we call morphs, in the attack anthrax. And those morphs were then the subject of an FBI, essentially worldwide search, certainly across this country and to some foreign labs. And the FBI wants you to believe that they acquired samples from every lab in the United States and some foreign labs that used this particular strain of anthrax called Ames anthrax. And they did the DNA testing and determined that they could narrow the field of suspects to Fort Detrick in Maryland, the United States Medical Research Institute for Infectious Diseases, USAMRID as we call it, and Bruce Ivins, who worked there, Dr. Ivins. And what they want you to believe is that only the Ames anthrax and Dr. Ivins flask, which he had a technical name for it, RMR 1029, had these fingerprint morphs. Now, there's a major problem with that. First of all, the anthrax that went into Dr. Ivins' flask, the 1029, 85% of it came from Dugway Proving Grounds, the Army's facility, bioweapons facility in Utah. And the FBI knew that. Dr. Ivins added 15% from his own stock because some of the Dugway stuff had contamination in it from another bacteria called B. subtilis, also called B. globigii, and a sort of common contaminant at Dugway. And when Dugway was making this anthrax for Dr. Ivins, they had to actually discard some of their production runs because it had so much contamination with the B. subtilis. And so if you look at Dr. Ivins' flask, which was the focus of the FBI's attention, it had two components. It had Dr. Ivins' sort of private stock, if you will, which was called RMR 1030, which he made there at Fort Detrick. And then you had Dugway's stock. And what the FBI hasn't made a big point of explaining to the public is they did test Dr. Ivins' private stock, RMR 1030. It didn't have the fingerprint morphs. They were missing from Dr. Ivins' stock. So if Ivins' flask only had two ingredients, one of which, Dr. Ivins' stock, didn't have the morphs had to come from the Dugway contribution. And the FBI has tried to convince the American people that they've narrowed the field to Fort Detrick in Maryland and Dr. Ivins, when in fact, that field of suspects should have been broadened to hundreds of people, including the folks who worked at Dugway Proving Ground, the folks who worked at Battelle, a laboratory working for the military and the CIA in Ohio, and all the folks who got anthrax from those two facilities. And so when we started investigating this, one of my first questions was how did the FBI avoid admitting what I just told you, which is that Dugway's anthrax had the fingerprint morphs, and the only reason Dr. Ivins' flask had them is they came from Dugway. And they never made that clear in their public statements. So in looking into it, we read the National Academy of Sciences report, the NRC, National Research Council of the National Academy of Sciences, they did a report after the FBI closed its investigation, and notably that scientific body, independent scientific body, was asked to look into the FBI science by the FBI itself, Director Mueller. And they started their inquiry, but before they could finish it, the FBI decided to close down their investigation before learning what the National Academy of Sciences had to tell the FBI about their science. Well, we learned a year after the FBI closed their investigation that the FBI science wasn't very good. In fact, it wasn't reliable enough to reach the conclusion on which the FBI's entire investigation was based, which is the fingerprints pointed to Dr. Ivan's supply of anthrax. And so there was no science really behind the FBI's conclusion. But it was worse than that. When you read the footnotes, and you really have to, and this is a long report, when you read the footnotes in the NRC report, you learn in 2011, a year after the FBI closed its investigation, from the NRC, not from the FBI, that Dr. Ivan's flask 1030 was tested and didn't have the fingerprint morphs, which is what leads to the conclusion that Dugway was the source of the fingerprint morphs, at least one of the sources. So then I asked myself the question, okay, now that I can prove that Dugway's anthrax had the fingerprints, why didn't the FBI tell the public that their samples they obtained from Dugway showed the fingerprint morphs? And the FBI made a point of telling the world that they subpoenaed or searched every lab that had this Ames anthrax. So they must have had Dugway samples. So we went through the Amerithrax, which is what the FBI calls its investigation, the Amerithrax documents, and we found the report where the FBI searched Dugway. They actually did search Dugway. And they obtained samples that Dugway made available from the production runs for making the anthrax that went into Dr. Ivan's flask. And the interesting thing about it was, and the NRC reported this, all of the samples the FBI gave from those production runs that Dugway gave to the FBI from those production runs were dead. They were non-viable. They wouldn't grow. Now, why does that matter? You can do DNA tests on, biological material that's not alive. DNA is still there. So why would that matter? Well, that was the next question in our inquiry. And then we stumbled over the fact, and the NRC reports this, that the FBI mysteriously adopted a protocol that they would not test any sample from any lab that was not viable, that was dead. And that conveniently allowed them to not do DNA test on Dugway samples because Dugway conveniently provided only dead samples. So for a reason that makes no scientific sense, the FBI didn't test the Dugway samples, they didn't report the results, and that is the only reason they didn't have to tell all of us that their entire case was based on a scientific misconception, and the fact that they didn't tell us indicates it was likely based on a scientific fraud. So we have put this evidence into our petition. In addition, once you realize that the field of suspects is broad, that it really should not have been narrowed to Dr. Ivins and Fort Detrick, then the question is, how do you legitimately narrow the field of suspects? And there are two ways to do that with the evidence that we've seen. One is you can look at, as David mentioned, the Bacillus subtilis contamination or subtilis contamination. That is found at Dugway. It was not found in Dr. Ivins' anthrax, and that contaminant had not been used at Fort Detrick for many years, since 1985. It was very common still at Dugway, and it led to, as I said, the rejection of some of the production runs for Dr. Ivan's stock. So Dugway was, a place to start looking. Now, David also mentioned there was some unusual silicon contamination in the attack anthrax. It turns out that for the second wave, that silicon was inside the anthrax spores, inside the exosporium on the spore coat. And at that point, there was a state-of-the-art technology. It was not known at that point to be used in making bioweapons, but it is, and Dr. Hugh Jones, Martin Hugh Jones has done some work on this. The evidence points to the fact that Battelle or maybe another CIA contractor was actually given a contract to do what we call microencapsulation, which is a process which could result in this inside the spore silicon contamination, which has the impact of making the anthrax more weaponized. So if you want to narrow the field, instead of focusing on Fort Detrick and Dr. Ivins, the FBI should have focused on Dugway and Battelle, maybe the CIA, to make a long story short. And so that information is being given to the United States Congress tonight in our petition. As Barb said, we'll be doing a follow-up, more detailed report for a grand jury petition on this same anthrax attack evidence. So before I close, let me just remind you that the anthrax investigation is new for the Lawyers Committee. In terms of what we're doing otherwise, we have an active lawsuit against the FBI for the failure of the FBI to honor the mandate from Congress to evaluate all 9/11 evidence, a mandate that came down in 2014, which led to the 9/11 Review Commission, which a lot of you still probably haven't heard of, chaired by Ed Meese. And that was basically, how shall I say, a commission that punted on the new evidence. And so we're suing the FBI to force them to look at that new evidence. That case is pending and in progress. As most of you know, we're suing the U.S. Attorney in New York to force our evidence on the controlled demolition, the World Trade Center towers in Building 7, to be submitted to a federal grand jury, which the U.S. Attorney has apparently not done. That lawsuit, we're waiting for a decision from the judge, expected any moment. We have 3 Freedom of Information cases that are in active litigation, one of which a magistrate judge has recommended giving us discovery, which would basically be the ability to subpoena witnesses from NIST and to find out why, what happened with their records about the, and this is FEMA as well, I should say, the building performance study data that they claim has sort of key documents have disappeared. So we're very busy with that litigation. And as David said, the next task up is a broader investigation of government misconduct in 9/11, which cuts across several fields. So let me close and see if there are any questions, and if Dave or Barbara or Richard have any closing comments.
Yeah, we got some questions too. Pardon if you mentioned this viewer says,
Okay.
and I missed it. But have you tried to reach out to family or other people who knew Bruce Ivins to see if they're willing to help in any way?
Yeah. Thus far, what we've done is we've actually talked to his son. His son is a police officer now. So that's, that's sort of confidential right now. His son told us some things that I don't want to, say publicly right now. What's happened though is his wife, Bruce Ivins' wife, is totally distraught. The son said she won't talk to anyone. His sister, they're twins, that he said maybe 50-50 she'll talk to someone. So we've gotten a lot of information about Bruce from his colleagues. 3 of the declarations I think I mentioned are from colonels. These are colonels in the Army, and they're all doctors at the highest level, and 4 doctors and 3 colonels. So that's pretty impressive. And of course, we talked to Richard Lambert, the head of the FBI, as a whistleblower. He head of when I say the FBI Amerithrax investigation, and that's significant. We've talked to Martin U. Jones that Mick mentioned, and Barbara Hatch Rosenberger. These are 2 of the top scientists in anthrax in the country. They were on this case the whole time. We've had this petition that Mick's mentioning to Congress reviewed by a colonel at Fort Detrick, who's a doctor, and by a top physician or doctor, top scientist in the country on anthrax. So we want to be absolutely right in what we're saying. we're saying we're taking this a new step. When Mick talks about the four morphs, when he talks about Dugway and the dead samples that they didn't want to test these dead, and we could have got DNA off of them, where Dugway was 85% responsible for what was in that flask, and the government said that flask is the fingerprint that does Ivans in. Where possibly 400 people had access to that flask. We showed through documents that that flask was not in a secure situation a lot of times. It was in an area where it was readily accessible by other scientists.
Hey, Dave.
Dugway could have been involved, the Battelle could have been involved, and that's only the beginning. We don't know where it will end, but we would want the Congress to investigate it, and we want to get a grand jury to look into it. We can only do so much in putting these facts together. So in reaching out as we go forward, and it's a really good question, we will probably talk. I have the addresses and phone numbers of all the victims. Remember, there were 17 people that were injured and 5 people that died. And we have their material. We have an investigator that located that for us. So when the time is right, we'll go forward with that. Because of the grand jury petition, we didn't submit that yet. But I thank you for the question, because we've been so busy. That's something we haven't paid a lot of attention to, but it's an important question. And again, thanks for asking it.
Yeah, Mick, you had a point?
Well, I just wanted to see if we had other questions, because I know we're short on time.
Yeah.
Okay, there you go, Dave. There's your cue. Hey, here's another question, though. Do you think pursuing the anthrax attacks would meet the same level of opposition that pursuing 9/11 has? And is there as much resistance by people in the bureaucracy to the anthrax issue?
Yeah, I would think not. There shouldn't be as much resistance. There was a grand jury already. As Barb mentioned, there's an admission that it's a domestic source. One thing that we haven't talked about yet are the crimes that are involved in these attacks. One of them is treason. People may not realize that. But you had an attempt to assassinate 2 U.S. senators from a domestic source inside the United States, and that is treason. So I would hope that a U.S. attorney and a grand jury and the United States Congress would embrace this petition and not be resistant to it, because the perpetrators for these attacks that tried to, literally assassinate members of Congress, they're still out there.
And what's important too, Richard, to realize in talking with these scientists and these colonels at Fort Detrick is there's a rift there, big rift, because they treated them all like suspects and they treated them bad. They had, were saying things about one guy that says things about another guy, and they tried to split them up. And they all knew that Ivans was innocent. So they knew the FBI wasn't looking in the right place. They looking at, not only was Ivans a scapegoat, but Fort Detrick was a scapegoat. And so you have the United States Army possibly wanting to get behind this, as we go forward with more people. If we have 4 declarations and we just started out, maybe we'll have a heck of a lot more declarations from military people. That is very significant. Very significant. And we have to go because we have another show we got to do. But again, if you like what we're doing, we need support and we need funds. So you can go to lc4for911.org, and anything you can contribute, it will be well spent, and we'll continue this fight with your help. But thank you very much. Thanks, Richard.
Thank you, Dave. And thank you, Mick. You guys are awesome. And hope we get the support that you need. And we'll definitely stay in touch, okay?
Okay, thank you.
All right. Bye-bye, guys.